Hi.
Am I interrupting?
Depends if you're bringing me food.
Yes.
Then no, you're not.
Okay.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Worldview. My name is Aaron Chandler Blake and this is Debunking Tartaria Part 4. If you're new here, first of all, thank you very much for tuning in. And second of all, welcome to the absolute madhouse that is the Tartarian Empire conspiracy. Also, if you are new here or you haven't seen the other episodes from this series, don't feel like you need to in order to understand what is going on in today's video. The series has been designed in a very particular way that allows you to watch it in whatever order you want. So you don't have to watch the other videos I've made in order to understand this one, but if you do want to watch those videos, I will leave the link in the description. But to save everyone a bit of time, here's a quick breakdown of everything we've covered in the series so far. First of all, in part 1 of the series, we studied the origins of the Tartarian theory through the likes of Anatoly Fomenko, looked at the history of the true Tartarian people, explained why old world maps featured a fictional Tartarian empire, and demonstrated how conspiracy influencers have stolen tropes from popular works of fiction to make the Tartarian theory sound more interesting. Then in part 2, we completely debunked the idea of a mudflood using geology. We also used the process of street level raising to explain buried floors of buildings, cast doubt on the possibility of liquefaction warfare, did a case study on the Alaskan boneyard, and questioned the Great Reset narrative. Finally, in part 3, we debunked the concept of Tartarian architecture. We did this by doing a ton of case studies on places like the Saigon Governor's Palace and the Great Wall of China. We proved we could build wonders in the old times, we explained how they built wonders in the old times, we proved we can still build wonders today, and then shed light on the true history of the World's Fairs. So please, before people start leaving comments saying things like, oh, what about this part of the theory? Oh, what about that part of the theory? Please watch the other videos I've made first, because more often than not, the questions people leave in the comments have been answered in my other videos. Upcoming topics for remaining episodes in the series also include orphan trains, media coverage, free energy, phantom time hypothesis, and giants. Today's main focus though is photography, so let's get into it. Have you ever looked at old photographs and wondered why the sky is such a weird colour? Or have you ever noticed that a lot of these city pictures don't seem to have any people in them? Maybe you've even wondered if there's more to these photographs than meets the eye. Well, the Tartarian Empire conspiracy would have you believe that they know the answers to these questions, and unfortunately they lead to a rather sinister conclusion. Theorists say the colour of the sky in these old photos is a weird vanilla colour because the world elite have manually bleached out the sky to hide advanced Tartarian technology such as airships, which would suggest that humanity achieved flight far sooner than conventional history would have us believe. In turn, this would prove that our conventional or mainstream historical timelines are in fact fake, and our ancestors were far more technologically advanced than we think. Theorists also claim that cities in old photographs appear empty because they were taken after the Great Reset and the mudfloods which wiped out all of the Tartarian people. This in turn left behind these empty cities which were found by survivors in the wake of the Tartarians' destruction. To cut to the chase, these photographs are allegedly proof that the Tartarian Empire was a victim of a global conspiracy at the hands of the world elite to wipe them from the face of the earth, to wipe them from our minds, and to wipe them from our history books. Although this sounds interesting, the reality of these photos is far simpler, as we will come to see. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the history of photography, why the skies are vanilla, why there are no people in these pictures, why we know Tartarian airships did not exist, and why a cover-up of this scale and this nature would be completely impractical. Before we get into the real meaty part of this conspiracy, I want to take a moment to talk about the history of photography, so the rest of this video is a little bit easier to understand. Tartarian theorists will often point out the flaws and the features of early photographs to suggest that they are fake or manipulated. But a lot of these comments are generally based on a misunderstanding of how early photography worked and also how it was used in those early years. When photography was first invented, it was pretty rare to see cameras among the general public. This is because it was very expensive, it was very time consuming, it was very complicated, and compared to modern photography, it was pretty inefficient as well. Because of this, it took several years for photography to gain any kind of commercial viability. In the early 1800s, there was a high demand for portraits and paintings, but it remained quite expensive and very time-consuming to get a proper painting commissioned from a genuine artist. As a result, people started looking for quicker and more effective ways to capture a moment in time. The first recorded attempt at photography happened much earlier than most people think, in 1717, when a man named Johann Heinrich Schulze attempted to capture a picture on a prepared page. Schulze noticed that silver nitrate darkened under sunlight, and he used this to capture the very first picture. However, it is not considered the first photograph as it was not a fixed image, which means that Schulze couldn't stop it from continuing to be affected by the light exposure until the image he had captured was no longer visible. Then in 1800, a man named Thomas Wedgwood tried to copy images onto light-sensitive glass covered in silver nitrate with the help of a camera obscura. But the process was slow, and the images produced were too faint to make out. Because of this, his experiments were unsuccessful, and he was never able to produce a permanent fixed image. It was discovered that permanent images could actually be captured using Wedgwood's method if you added sodium hyposulfite, but this discovery wasn't made until after Wedgwood died in 1805, which is pretty typical. Finally though, a man named Joseph Niepce managed to capture the first photographic image in 1826 using a homemade heliograph. It took several days of constant exposure for the image to be ingrained onto the pewter plate, but the end result was the first ever true photograph. But Aaron, if photography has been around for this long, then why are most of the old photos we have from several decades later? Good question. And thankfully, it's a good question that we have a good answer for. Even though the first photo was officially captured in 1826, it took literal days of exposure to get this photo, and at the time there were no means to mass produce the equipment needed to properly operate cameras. As a result, photography remained a pretty niche movement, and it didn't really start picking up traction until after Niepce's death. The first version of photography that showed commercial potential was daguerreotype photography, which was invented by Louis Daguerre in 1838. This was a huge improvement on Niepce's heliograph because it produced much clearer images and it needed a much shorter exposure time. As for photography becoming popular with the working class, it wasn't until George Eastman released the first Kodak camera in 1888 that we really started to see photography become a part of our everyday lives. This, coupled with the explosion of commercial photography studios, gave way to amateur photography, and taking pictures has been a big part of our lives ever since. An issue with a lot of the Tartarian arguments about old photography is that theorists tend to view photography from a modern lens, instead of seeing it from a contemporary perspective. So this is a logical fallacy called presentism, where people judge the past with the expectations of the present. Theorists expect photography to be highly abundant and good quality in the 1830s because that is what photography is like today. However, a lot of theorists don't seem to understand the evolutionary timeline needed for technology like cameras to reach the standards we see today. Technology starts very primitive, and as our understanding of it improves, so does the reliability and complexity of the product. A perfect example of this that's a bit more modern and probably a bit more relatable for people is the evolution of mobile phones. So the first phone call was made in 1973, but the phones didn't become commercially viable until about 1984. And then even after that, they didn't properly take off until the mid-late 90s. And that same sort of logic and that same sort of timeline applies to the evolution of photography. These timelines are why we don't have many photographs from the 1820s, we don't have high-definition photos from the 1830s, and we don't have much lifestyle photography from the 1850s. It's because it takes time to develop this technology. Actually, the last of those 3 points segues quite nicely into our next chapter. A big factor of the Great Reset theory is old photographs that show empty cities and streets with no people or road traffic in sight. Theorists claim that this is evidence of a mass extinction level event, which wiped out scores of people, leaving behind these empty cities that we found and claimed as our own. A lot of theorists seem to believe that we founded these buildings because it has the date that they were founded written on them, which to them means we literally found them. When you see founded written on a building, that is in reference to the date the foundation stone was laid when they started building it. It has nothing to do with literally finding the building when we were out for a walk one day. To be honest, the found city argument is one of the weaker aspects of the Tartarian Empire conspiracy. I'm genuinely surprised that theorists give this part of it so much airtime, and it normally has to be propped up by other genuine conspiracies like the orphan trains that in reality have absolutely nothing to do with Tartaria anyway. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll go into more detail on the orphan trains in episode 7, but right now I want to focus exclusively on the empty cities themselves. As I already mentioned, early cameras needed really long exposure times to properly capture a picture. The The long exposure time meant that moving objects, such as people, were not picked up by the camera as they didn't stay still for long enough to make an imprint on the pewter plates used in early cameras. Fun fact for you, these long exposure times are also why we have so many Victorian ghost pictures. A lot of photos from the Victorian era show translucent or incomplete figures of people, which were caused by people walking across the front of the camera and not being fully captured by the long exposure time. Anyway, this long exposure argument is clearly backed up by many early photos which show motion blur, irregular shadows, or movements in the sunlight caused by the prolonged exposure needed to capture an image. This is the first picture to ever successfully capture a person, and it was taken by the previously mentioned Louis Daguerre. This picture needed a 10-minute exposure time, and the two people on the street are the first people to ever be successfully photographed. They were still for enough time to appear in the photo because the standing man is likely getting his shoes shined by the boy sitting on the box. If you look closely at the other parts of the image, you can see shadows and blurs on the road that were likely horses and carts that stopped briefly but not for long enough to get captured in detail. Adding to this picture was taken in 1838, which predates many theorists' estimation of when the mud flood or mud floods actually happened. This raises a lot of questions that the mud flood theory seemingly can't answer, such as, if the mud floods wiped everyone out, then why did the cities appear empty before they happened? And if the mud flood had already happened, and there were no people left, then who cleared the several thousand cubic tons of mud out of the way before this picture was taken? It just doesn't add up, and until theorists can come up with a definitive year and explicitly say exactly when the mud flood or mud floods happened, questions like this are going to carry on being a huge problem for them. Theorists raise questions about why we don't have photos of old buildings being constructed, and when they are shown pictures of these buildings being constructed, they tend to call them fake anyway. The motivation for calling these pictures fake either stems from the nature of these pictures or just a sheer unwillingness to admit that they're wrong. I can't do much about the second of those two things, but allow me to address the first one. One reason photography remained niche for so many years is because it was quite complicated and difficult to operate early cameras. As a result, photography stayed in the hands of specialists who had to dedicate a lot of time and effort to produce quite a small number of photos compared to modern day photographers. Photography, as it was quite rare and expensive in its early days, was generally saved for more special occasions and wouldn't have been wasted on what they would have considered to be small things. This is why photos of old buildings generally weren't taken until after the building had been finished, but there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of actual construction photos available that theorists for some reason choose to ignore. And I'm going to use the Eiffel Tower as an example to demonstrate this. The first argument about the Eiffel Tower is that it's actually much older than conventional history suggests. But this is easily debunked by these photos, which were taken by Edouard Durandal at the request of Gustave Eiffel during the 18-month construction period from 1887 to 1889. Plus, people could easily prove that the Eiffel Tower is much older than conventional history says, simply by finding a photograph of it that was taken before 1887. Yet no one has ever managed to do this, and theorists, for some reason, don't seem interested in asking themselves why that is. Theorists also argue that we could not have built the Eiffel Tower in 18 months even with the technology we have today, let alone the technology back then. But as I mentioned in my last video, the Tokyo Tower is more or less a 1-to-1 scale replica of the Eiffel Tower that was completed in 1958 after 18 months of construction. Anyway, if you want more up close and personal pictures of the Eiffel Tower being built, then here's a photograph of it under construction with the scaffolding still in place. We also have photos taken on the Eiffel Tower which show workers completing the construction, such as this photo which shows them building one of the lifts. I've also had Tartarian theorists claim that you can't see Paris in the background of these Eiffel Tower pictures because Paris as a city hadn't been built yet, proving that the Eiffel Tower is in fact much older than we think. Not only is this obviously nonsense because we have historical records of Paris that go back for literal centuries, but if you look at modern pictures of the Eiffel Tower, you will see that there are still no buildings underneath or directly next to it. Unless of course you're going to suggest that the city of Paris hadn't been built yet when this was taken. But all of these what about replies from theorists just prove beyond any doubt that there will never be enough evidence to convince some of these people. And it really highlights the difficulty of fighting a belief that is based on an emotional impulse rather than logical analysis. But whatever, I digress. Moving on. Theorists will sometimes talk about what the people in these photographs are wearing and use it as proof to suggest that they are not the builders. First of all, absolutely no one is suggesting that these older portly men in shine shoes and suits are the ones setting the concrete or driving in the rivets. These men are usually project managers, company CEOs or other important figures who would have had the actual workers moved out of the way so these photos could be taken. These pictures were generally taken for commemorative purposes or to impress potential investors. It wasn't to keep a minute-by-minute manual labour record because that's not what the investors wanted to see and also not what they really cared about. They didn't care about the manual labourers, they just wanted to see the progress that was being made with their money. Also, it's the 1880s, what else would they be wearing? In the days before cheap clothing and mass-produced casual wear, clothing options were a lot more limited. This is why even as we head into the 1930s, you'll see the men in casual wear and women in well-covering dresses. Plus, safety standards for construction clothing back then were much lower compared to today. Hard hats weren't mandated until the 1930s and high-vis jackets didn't become widespread safety equipment until the 1960s. So obviously these workers several decades prior aren't going to have them. Again, this is a great example of presentism as our modern perspective skews our view of the past. Just because our modern builders have to wear lots of safety equipment and high-vis equipment, it doesn't mean it has always been that way. These people had no concept of risk assessments or high visibility safety equipment. So asking someone from the 1800s why they weren't dressed like this would be like asking Icarus why he didn't just book a Ryanair flight. In the same sense, just because we take pictures of absolutely everything in our lives now, it doesn't mean it has always been that way. People in the 1850s generally wouldn't take pictures of themselves doing mundane tasks like their job just to prove that they were doing it. It was blatantly obvious to these construction workers that they were building something, because to them, the existence of a building that previously was not there is enough proof that they built it. It'd be like asking someone to prove that they've made a round of drinks while everyone in the room has a cup of tea. Speaking of which. So, the vanilla skies argument. This is based around the idea that the colour of the sky in old photographs has been altered by the world elite to hide Tartarian technology such as airships. I'll come back to the airship side of this argument in a minute, but for now I want to focus purely and exclusively on the so-called vanilla skies themselves. In many old photos you'll notice that the sky is usually featureless and is generally this vanilla-ish colour. Tartarian theorists seem to believe that the skies in these photos have been whitewashed, or vanilla washed I suppose, to remove all traces of Tartarian airships and technology that were originally photographed in the sky. In reality though, the sky isn't this weird colour because the photos have been altered or manipulated in any way, it's because of the light exposure mechanisms in early cameras. Early cameras used something called orthochromatic film which overexposed blue light. This explains why in old photographs the sky always looks so blown out. We can see this today because we still have a number of fully operational old cameras that continue to produce photographs with the same effect. For example, there's this amazing guy on Instagram called Expired Film Club who takes old cameras to current sporting events. These modern pictures taken with old film cameras quite clearly include vanilla skies like the old photos taken on the very same cameras, which proves beyond doubt that the vanilla sky effect is not an intentional manipulation and is instead a side effect of primitive camera film. Besides this though, how exactly are the world elite meant to track down, steal, manipulate and return every single old photograph that was ever taken that includes a Tartarian airship? If they wanted to erase Tartarian airships from every single photo that had ever been taken of them, they would need to independently track down tens of thousands of photographers from all over the world before any form of digital tracking or digitalization in general existed. That isn't just unlikely, it is completely undoable in an offline analog world. There is no way you can genuinely believe the world elite broke into potentially millions of houses all over the world and manually altered every single photograph they found like some kind of shutterbug Santa Claus. It is completely impractical. To any theorists watching who disagree, please explain to me how the idea of the world elite doing all of that is plausible, yet the idea that we managed to build the Eiffel Tower just a few decades before World War I isn't. Plus, many of these pictures of vanilla skies were taken several decades after the Tartarian Empire allegedly fell and had all of their technology erased. Some of these photographs are also taken several years after flight was actually achieved, so what would be the point of editing the sky and what exactly was left for them to hide? At this stage, I do want to acknowledge a real historical mystery which, much like the orphan trains that I'll talk about in episode 7, has been hijacked by theorists to supposedly act as evidence for the Tartarian Empire. Most theorists extend the airship argument far beyond the 19th century, and that is the aspect of this conspiracy that I want to focus on now. But before we get to that, I want to take a moment to talk to my Indian audience, and I sincerely apologise for how I'm about to pronounce the names in this part of the video. An ancient historical mystery that has always fascinated me is the story of the Vimanas, or Vimans, depending on who you ask. Vimanas appear in the ancient Sanskrit texts such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Vimanas are described as flying crafts that existed in India about 6,000 years ago and are generally associated with gods or seen as divine vehicles. Because of this, theorists suggest that Vimanas are evidence of Tartarian airships. But the truth is, these two things are not associated with each other at all. Old Sanskrit writings go into great detail on the names, owners and abilities of Vimanas. Several aircraft are described in the Mahabharata, such as King Shalva's Soba Vimana, which could apparently fly at incredible speeds, achieve altitude so great that bystanders could no longer see it from the ground, and was capable of incredible destruction. Some people think descriptions like this are evidence of ancient advanced technology, while other people see it as metaphorical or purely mythological. People cast doubt on the Vimanas as we have never found any physical evidence to support their existence, while people who do believe in them claim that these highly regarded ancient texts mentioning them this many times must point to something. Now, onto the Vimanaka Shastra. This book can allegedly trace its origins back over 9,000 years and details designs of ancient aircraft both in text and with diagrams. The version that is widely circulated today was written by Pandit Shastri, who claims that the text was revealed to him by a long-dead sage while he was in a psychic trance. However, there are a few issues with Shastri's claims. First of all, it's claimed that the Vimanaka Shastra is a text that dates back over 9,000 years. Yet we can find no record of it existing before the 20th century. Next, Shastri claims that he channeled the book's content from Bharadvaja before he relayed this information to his associates. The problem with this story is that there were no other witnesses, so the only proof we have that it came directly from the ancient sage himself is the fact that Shastri and his devotees said so. Next, the diagrams of the craft weren't included in the original Hindi version of the book, and were instead added to the English translation that wasn't published until 15 years after Shastri had died. So these diagrams are not only heavily influenced by artistic interpretation, but they are also not drawn under the supervision of the only person who claimed to have any knowledge of them. Another issue is that in 1974, the Indian Institute of Science ran tests on the aircraft described in the book and found they were not capable of flight. They also found that these texts were inconsistent when giving dimensions to some of the craft. Some did not give enough specific details on how they actually worked, and concluded that these designs were a gross violation of Newton's laws. It just shows, based off this evidence, that if they did exist, they looked nothing like this, and they operated in a completely different way to how Shastri described them. So when theorists use these specific designs as proof of Tartarian airships, it's effectively a self-debunk, because these craft could not have flown, and every attempt to replicate one has proved this. But the possible truth behind Vimanas does not necessarily act as evidence to support the Tartarian Empire, the same way that if we were to prove dragons are real, that would not by default prove that giants were real as well. In fact, some of these ancient texts directly contradict aspects of the Tartarian Empire theory. One of the texts said that Vimanas move from globe to globe, yet many Tartarian theorists are flat earthers. So did we have interplanetary travel 6,000 years ago, or is space fake? You can't have both. Estimated that India has around 30 million ancient manuscripts dating back over 6,000 years, which directly contradicts the fabricated history narrative spun by the likes of Anatoly Fomenko. It's also worth mentioning that none of these ancient scripts mention Tartaria or any other highly advanced civilization located in the Far East. But if theorists really do believe that Vimanas are proof that the Tartarian Empire A existed and B had access to hyper-advanced technology, then the burden of that proof is on the claimant. I've just shown my evidence that suggests Vimanas and Tartaria aren't even compatible, let alone connected. So if you disagree, show me your proof that confirms the connection between Vimanas and Tartaria. Otherwise, this claim is nothing more than false cause. Even if we can 100% confirm the existence of Vimanas, that would not support the idea of a 19th century global superpower that was highly advanced, because they are two completely unrelated issues. I would love to go into more detail about this, but I'll probably get sidetracked and lose the main point of the video. So I'm going to leave the Vimanas discussion there for today. However, this is something I would really be interested in making a full-length video on. So if that's something you'd be interested in watching in future, then be sure to let me know in the comments. As you've already discussed, a big part of the Tartarian theory is this idea of advanced airships. Besides vanilla skies, theorists point towards two pieces of evidence that suggest the existence of Tartarian airships. The first is the idea of ancient airships, but as we've just discussed, the existence of ancient airships wouldn't necessarily prove the existence of the Tartarian Empire. The second is early 20th century photographs featuring zeppelins and blimps, which theorists suggest shows a false narrative concerning the history of aviation. The point I would like to raise here is that almost all of these alleged photographs of Tartarian airships are in fact AI generated. And it doesn't really fill you with confidence when a theory like this that apparently has so much evidence needs to be propped up by AI generated photographs. But the main question I want to raise about airship theory is, why do Tartarian theorists act like zeppelins and blimps are the pinnacle of aviation? Like, zeppelins and blimps are incredibly ineffective compared to modern methods of aviation. I'm not saying that modern planes are completely safe, of course, because they're not, but to live with this belief that this could outperform modern airliners in any way is just pure fantasy. At this stage though, I do want to give Tartarian theorists a bit of credit. You'll always hear them talking about the fact that the Wright brothers didn't invent flight and history books have lied to you about aviation. I give them credit for this because that's actually true. I can already hear people in the comments jumping on what I just said. I just want to clarify, that observation does not mean the Tartarian airships existed, and it does not mean the Tartarian Empire existed either. All this shows is that theorists have found a loophole in historic teachings and they have exploited it to suit their own narrative, which, if I'm being honest, happens pretty consistently with Tartarian Empire theory. The Wright brothers were not the first people to achieve flight. They were not the first people to patent an aircraft, and there is potentially a genuine conspiracy hidden within this case. The first airship patent was filed in 1895 by Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, where he proposed a design for a cigar-shaped craft supported by metal framing and filled with gas bags. The first successful Zeppelin flight took place in 1900, 3 whole years before the Wright brothers made headlines. But hot air balloons had been a common part of life for over 100 years by this point. In fact, Napoleon wanted to use hot air balloons as part of his invasion of Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, but unfavourable winds meant he had to pull the plug on the operation. So when you see Tartarian theorists reference old eyewitness accounts and people in the 1800s talking about seeing balloon-like craft in the sky, those eyewitness accounts are probably true. However, they are not Tartarian airships, they are hot air balloons as they had been invented by then, and conventional history fully acknowledges this. Anyway, in 1903, a man named Charles Frederick Page filed a patent for a bi-balloon flyable airship, a few months before the Wright brothers successfully took flight. We never hear about Page because no one ever actually witnessed his aircraft in flight, and it went missing while being transported to the 1904 World's Fair in Missouri. The Nautic competition that was being held that year had a grand prize of $100,000 US, and had Page's craft not gone missing, he probably would have stood a good chance of winning. Years later though, Page's daughter said that she had always suspected foul play, and thought that the event organisers had stolen his airship to stop it from winning. Other inventors from the late 19th and early 20th centuries all tried and failed to make a functioning aircraft, but in 1902, a man named Burrell Cannon might have beaten the Wright brothers to the punch. His flying machine, named the Ezekiel Airship, was allegedly witnessed to have flown a distance of over 150 feet in Pittsburgh, Texas, over a year before the Wright brothers took flight. However, there are no films, photographs or reliable eyewitness accounts to confirm that the aircraft actually did take flight. Not even Burrell Cannon himself was present for the flight of the Ezekiel Airship, as he was preaching at a nearby church when it happened. Interestingly, the Ezekiel Airship was also scheduled to appear at the 1904 World's Fair, but much like Frederick Page's craft, it too went missing while being transported to Missouri. Adding to this is the fact that the $100,000 prize at the 1904 World's Fair actually went unclaimed. So the conspiracy goes that event organisers sabotaged potential winning aircraft so they wouldn't have to pay out this huge stack of prize money. Luckily for the Wright brothers though, they didn't enter the competition as they were busy perfecting the Flyer 2 and didn't want to give away their secrets. And as we know, the rest is history. But there could be an even earlier account of flight, and for this one we need to go back to India. A man named Shivkar Talpade allegedly achieved flight in 1895 using information in the ancient Vedic texts. However, there are no official records of this craft taking flight. No photos of the craft at all, let alone one of it flying, and even though the flight was said to have been witnessed by over 3,000 people, not a single eyewitness account of the flight actually exists. Supporters claim that people don't know about this because there was no media in India at the time. This is despite the fact that India was still part of the British Empire and was repeatedly reported on by British media. If an invention like this cropped up in British India while the empire was at its peak, there is absolutely no way the British Empire wouldn't have jumped at this opportunity. Plus, all reports of the craft say that it was unmanned, so even if it did achieve flight, Talpade would still not be the first person to achieve flight as he wasn't in the craft when it took off. But despite all of these uncertainties, aviation has gone on to become the phenomenon it is today because of things like airliners and helicopters, not zeppelins and blimps. Zeppelins couldn't keep up with the pace of human innovation and they simply got left behind in favour of more reliable technology. The rapid development of planes during World War I showed they had far more potential than Zeppelins in the long run, which saw them gain much more investment during the interwar years. Plus, a number of airship disasters saw the public lose faith in Zeppelins. This, coupled with the continued rise of planes, saw Zeppelins face a rapid decline in popularity. Now, I know what you're thinking. You think I'm going to use the Hindenburg disaster as an example to show that Zeppelins weren't reliable, but I know people in the Tartarian conspiracy circles believe that this was some kind of cover-up or setup, so I'll save my breath. What I'll do instead though is show you that the Hindenburg disaster was not an isolated incident and Zeppelins and airships were incredibly unreliable for the majority of their lifetimes. In fact, there were 10 airship crashes between 1906 and 1912 just in Germany. The first was in 1906 just outside of Munich, when the ship LZ-2 was heavily damaged by a storm and rendered flightless. Then in September 1912, Zeppelin L-1 got caught in a storm near the German coast and crashed, killing 14 people. Airships weren't phased out because the world elite don't want you to know about them. Airships got phased out because they were unreliable and got undercut by more effective methods of aviation. Before we finish this section on airships, I would again like to bring people's attention to the lack of evidence that exists to support the idea of Tartarian airships. Big technology leaves big, long, boring paper trails like metallurgical records, supply chains, transitional prototypes, patents and more, yet there is not a single scrap of evidence along these lines that confirms the existence of Tartarian airships. Theorists cannot produce any record of where they were built, how they were built, the date the patents were filed, the names of the people who filed these patents, the names of the craft, the size of the craft, the capacity of the craft, and the list goes on and on and on. By the end of the 19th century, industrialized countries are documenting almost everything, and we still have the majority of these records today to prove it. So if the Tartarian Empire was the single most industrialized entity in the world 200 years ago, why can we not find a single scrap of paperwork to support the idea that it actually existed? Like, the Vimanas predate the alleged twilight years of the Tartarian airships by over 5,000 years, and we still have records of them. Where are the much more modern records to support Tartarian airships? Are we really meant to believe that the world elite failed in eliminating publicly accessible maps that show the Tartarian Empire, and even removing the people of the Tartarian ethnicity itself, yet were 100% effective when tracking down and eliminating every scrap of private sector paperwork from a globe-spanning industrialized empire? Not only is this idea wrong, but it doesn't even make sense. I know I've already used this phrase, but I think the airships argument is a bit of a logical fallacy. Theorists' evidence that airships are removed from 19th century photos is the fact they have no 19th century photos of airships in them. So your proof is that you have no proof. Great. Not only this, but pictures from the 19th century that do contain airships are fully explained by conventional history, and then the ones that are shared on Tartarian forums are almost always AI anyway. There's a certain level of irony to theorists thinking that 1800s contemporary photography is fake, and then in the next breath they'll turn around and put their faith in images that are blatantly AI generated. Are you starting to notice a theme with all these spin-off theories? Ancient airships, orphan trains, the Great Reset, even Flat Earth, they all get roped into Tartaria. Why? And more importantly, why do people believe it? Well, it's not the evidence that's convincing, it's the association. Tartarian theorists see a mystery, and they immediately believe it has to be related to Tartaria because that is how social media has trained them to think. This has been done using a media propaganda technique called semiotics. Now, if you're unfamiliar with semiotics, the principle is quite simple. It's basically training people to associate certain images and words with specific meanings. I'm sure we're all familiar with the famous "this is not a pipe" painting. It's not a pipe, it's a painting, but pattern recognition in our mind makes us think that it is a pipe even though technically it's not. Semiotics is actually a pretty simple concept that is in your face every day, but most people barely notice it. Just to clarify, that's not a dig at anyone, it's just the fact that most people aren't aware of semiotics. But semiotics goes much deeper than "this is not a pipe", and photography is an excellent vehicle for it. News outlets use semiotics through carefully selected images and language choice to tailor-make a preferred reading of events. For example, in a conflict that will remain nameless, the BBC described one side as having hostages while the other side have prisoners. This is so you subconsciously associate one side as being the aggressor and the other as the victim. As an example from photography, we can look at football. If a football team loses, then a newspaper will use a picture of the manager to make it seem like the loss was the manager's fault. Whereas if the same football team wins the following week, the newspaper will use a picture of a player so people don't associate the positive result with the manager. This same technique has been used against Tartarian theorists by conspiracy influencers. These outlets have been so prolific and social media rabbit holes have become so ingrained that they have managed to convince people to associate certain ideas with certain imagery even if there is no actual correlation between them. So now when these people see a pale sky in an old photo, they immediately think it's a cover-up. When these people see an empty street in an old photo, they immediately think Great Reset. When they see an old photo of a big building, they immediately assume it's Tartaria. The best part about this is, social media conspiracy theorists don't even need to mention Tartaria anymore, because the association has already been built in the mind of their audience. These pages know all of their followers will semiotically associate their content with Tartaria because they've ingrained the idea into them. This in turn makes it seem like a consensus of opinion to passers-by who stumble across Tartaria in comment sections. It paints a completely false narrative, and the Tartarian Empire conspiracy has been designed so meticulously that it has managed to con thousands of people into increasing its semiotic value, while most of these people don't even understand what semiotics means. The reason I mention this is because once you start noticing it, you will see semiotics everywhere. Not just in conspiracies, but in politics, in news, in marketing, even in music. Next time you see an article about a war, write down all of the adjectives used to describe both sides, and I bet you will be absolutely shocked by the contrast in language. So again, the reason I mention this is because semiotics is a very simple tool that is used to manipulate the way you think every single day, and the only defense you really have against it is noticing it. So next time you see a post about Tartaria, or politics, or anything else, think about what the semiotic value of that article is. Think about what the preferred reading is. Think about what they want you to believe, and then ask yourself why they want you to believe that. I bet it will stop you from being so easily influenced by these things. So to conclude, Tartarian theorists say that old photographs can't be trusted. Then they'll use old photographs of empty cities to prove that the Great Reset happened. You cannot call old photography unreliable, then use it as a crutch to prop up your conspiracy in the next breath. Picking and choosing when to believe things is not doing your own research, that is cherry picking and confirmational bias. It's also odd that Tartarian theorists refuse to believe that photographs like this are real, yet will happily believe heavily artistically influenced pictures like this and use them as evidence of Tartarian airships. But theorists don't cling to these ideas simply because they want to believe them or because of semiotics. They cling to them because it highlights errors in our history books, and also because people are no longer willing to admit that they're wrong. Well, I've expressed my dissent towards the school history curriculum a few times in the past, and I'm going to take the opportunity to do it again now. School history books will teach you things like James Cook was the first man to discover Australia. They'll teach you the Wright brothers invented flight, and they'll teach you that your country were the good guys in every war they ever fought. With exception to Germany anyway. But teaching kids things that aren't strictly true is a big problem, because when those kids grow up and realise what they were taught isn't true, it gives them the ammunition they need to distrust history. Then social media conspiracy theorists who peddle things like Tartaria will capitalise on this distrust for their own monetary gain. School history books are a little more honest, a little less nationalistic, and spend less time glazing over and sugarcoating certain things, then things like the Tartarian theory wouldn't exist because people would have far more trust in history. So I want to finish this video on a positive note, because despite how it may seem, I don't have any ill intent towards people who have been lied to about the Tartarian theory. I just want you to know that if you're still watching this as a Tartarian conspiracy theorist, we are not going to judge you if you admit you were wrong. We are not going to judge you if you admit you were lied to. And if there's even one person watching this right now who decides that they are going to stop believing in the Tartarian theory because of this video, then I will consider it a huge success. But until then, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'm impressed you've made it this far. If you're still watching at this stage, please be sure to leave a like and a subscribe. It's very difficult for amateur creators like me to get off the ground on YouTube these days, so any support you can offer me will be greatly appreciated. I'm already working on part 5 of this series. I'm working on a comment reply video, and I'm also working on some content that's not related to Tartaria. So if you do want to see that content, like I said, make sure you subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you next time.